The woke postmodern paradox. Now, I want to start by talking about the most anti-sexist, anti-racist, and anti-privilege movement ever. Race, class, and sex, these are the most engaged social issues of our generation, being opposed to racism, sexism, privilege. Now, when we turn to the woke, especially woke activists and their theorists, they sometimes want to assert a monopoly on being anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-privilege. They easily accuse their enemies of all sorts of bad things, hidebound reaction fascism, various other anti-progressive attitudes, and they frequently seek to shut them down. Now, this raises the first of two puzzles about the woke movement. Modern liberalism has been the most anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-privilege movement in history, yet wokeism rejects liberalism. Now, I'm using liberalism as a big tent, classical liberalism, and this is going to include a significant number of liberals, realistic liberals, conservatives, and libertarians. But for 4 centuries, that big tent of modern liberalism, and modern liberals in particular, have been dedicated to getting rid of unjust barriers to freedom and equality. They've been motivated by a highly idealistic vision of the heights that individuals can achieve, by concern for those who are struggling with adversity and for the genuinely oppressed, and they've been committed to the optimistic idea that we can make progress in all major areas of life. Consider the track record of the modern liberals. They accomplished a breakdown of ages-old feudal privilege. They rejected the domination of the weak by strong as intrinsic to the natural order. They extended rights to all individuals as a matter of universal moral principle. They then eliminated the easy assumption of women's second and third class social standing. They attacked ethnic and racial prejudice as atavistic, as a throwback to a darker time. And they drove the millennia upon millennia old institution of slavery into extinction in many parts of the world and underground elsewhere. And this is amazing. It is a striking historical fact. This is a relatively short period of time. A couple of centuries, the modern world has effected a series of major revolutions. It's the most progressive movement ever. Now, intellectually, modernism was underway by the 1500s and the 1600s with formative figures Francis Bacon, Galileo Galilei, René Descartes, and John Locke. And here we're going from late 1500s to late 1600s. And what they accomplished was the valorization of human reason, the calls for individual rights and tolerance. Now, by the 1700s, those ideas had achieved widespread acceptance, especially among the educated and the culturally influential, and that movement self-consciously labeled itself the Enlightenment. Now then, institutionally and consequently from these early modern revolutions and the Enlightenment of the 1700s, by the 1700s and on into the 1800s, new organizations came into existence, including the world's first ever anti-slavery societies and feminist organizations. And they were vigorously transforming informal, cultural, and formal institutional practices both. By the 1900s, much progress had been made, and it continued to be made into the 2000s. So how do we explain the newly woke, this generation? While they are a part of modern liberal society, they have rejected its key tenets and are in most instances actively attacking and undermining them. The subversion and or open rejection includes not only substantive accomplishments of modernism. They seem to be opposed to much of science, much of technology, free markets, free political institutions, and more. But they're also opposed to the methods by which we learn about them and do those things. Civil conversation, open debates, opposition to censorship, mutual toleration of criticism, and sometimes putting up with repugnant opinions in the public space. Now, one would expect that those who are genuinely committed to moral progress to join enthusiastically with the greatest anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-privilege movement in history, and that is modern liberalism and the Enlightenment. Now, the second puzzle about the woke is its roots in postmodernism. And this one also is an intellectual puzzle. Postmodernism has perhaps been the most vigorous intellectual and activist movement of the past two generations. Now, it came to maturity intellectually, especially in the 1960s through the 1980s. Postmodernism is characterized by a fundamental skepticism of meta-narratives, that's big picture explanations of the world, increasingly skeptical of any narratives at all, in fact. It's also committed to a fundamentally adversarial and cynical understanding of power. Now, such skepticism has the epistemologically corrosive effect of kind of clearing the intellectual ground and leaving nothing standing. Any philosophy or ideology or theory can be subjected to deconstruction, postmodern skepticism, and it can be set aside as, that's just meaningless rhetoric. It's merely a subjective preference, or that's just a mask for an agenda, or that's just a manifestation of some group's power aspirations, and so on. All of those are variations on postmodern skepticism and cynicism. But the leading postmodernists of the 1960s to the 1980s, and here I would name Michel Foucault, Richard Rorty, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, and some others, they were still primarily intellectuals, however politically charged they were personally. And the negativity of their philosophical answers, their negative philosophy, it still, though, leaves open the question, what should one do next? Because one can reach the intellectual conclusion that no belief is rational, or that no knowledge can be rationally and objectively grounded, and still have no subsequent plan of action. From an intellectual negative skepticism, etc., there's no action positive that follows of necessity. So then we get the second puzzle. How does wokeism, with what seems to be universalist and absolutist activist claims, right? They don't come across at all as about skeptical about anything, and they're saying this is how it is, this is how everybody should behave, and they are ready to be absolutely certain, all right, about those claims. And they are willing to follow up with that with physical compulsion, or of course things very close to physical compulsion. And how can that universalism and absolutism stem from what seems like a skeptical and empty intellectualism like postmodernism? So the term the woke, it's a useful shorthand label, and here today in this episode I want to argue that wokeism is not one unified thing, but it's a loose coalition around some central themes. The woke do reject the modern liberal project, but the modern liberal project itself is a very broad set of ideas and institutions, and consequently, the various strands of the woke are animated in their distrust, their rejection of different aspects of modern liberalism. And those rejections also have histories. Modern liberalism, of course, has been controversial. It's been subject to criticism from its beginnings. So the current manifestations of woke also come out of sometimes competing, sometimes complementary intellectual and activist traditions. So there's a big territory. It's a complicated territory with a history, and I want to try to get some of it sorted out today. So what I want to do in this big tent analysis is say there's really four major strands of wokeism, and I'm going to give them the following names. There is the anti-modern woke. There's the Great Awakening. There's the dictatorship of the woketariat, and there are the Mott and Bailey wokists. Now that's 4 shorthand tags. Some of those names I'm kind of having fun with, but I'm going to go through them and elaborate what goes into each of them. And now each of those has activists, it has intellectuals, public intellectuals, it has a broad movement of supporters, but they also have an intellectual, philosophical, ideological lineage. So if we take the anti-modern woke, this is a movement that has its roots in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the very early anti-Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment thinkers, and a screaming collectivist and authoritarian in his politics. But there's a long tradition coming out of Rousseau and his great influence. Also, Johann Herder, less well known, but also very important in the late 1700s on into the 1800s. And as we get into the 20th century, Martin Heidegger, a giant on the philosophical landscape, but all of them are anti-modernists. And their viewpoint follows from a decision to reject modern world's claims to a kind of humanism, a universalistic understanding of human nature and morals and rights, and the idea that we can make progress, and instead they commit to a relativized tribalism. Now that's going to then be in the contemporary woke form, that kind of group balkanization phenomenon, certain kinds of identity politics where we reject the idea that human beings are universal things with the same knowledge, the same moral values, and so the same general rights. Instead, we get this tribalism and a kind of relativism. Now that's the anti-modern woke. We'll come back to them. Now, there's another strain, though, that focuses more on cognitive issues, and in fact anti-cognitive issues. And this one I'm calling the Great Awakening, playing off the idea of the Great Awakening, a religious revival, very strongly faith-based, of the 1700s on into the 1800s. So the Great Awakening picks up on the oft-noted parallels to the psychology of religion that we seem to find in the woke. And this one has its roots in Soren Kierkegaard with his valorization of faith, Jean-Paul Sartre with his idea of ungrounded subjective commitments to a value framework. And what it does is it follows from a rejection of value objectivity in any form, and instead committing subjectively to a set of values, finding meaning in that really fiercely held but non-rational commitment to an ideology, to a value framework, to a politics. And it's that non-rational commitment that's fiercely held, that's the contemporary woke as a religion phenomenon. Now, the dictatorship of the woketariat, obviously playing off the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is a more politicized woke, not so much being about anti-modernism and focusing on tribalism and relativity, but focusing on political issues. It has its roots in Karl Marx and the Frankfurt School. Here it would be including Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse. And here what we have is the use of skeptical and relativistic claims, but tactically. They're being used as rhetorical weapons, and they are usually selectively applied in what they're taking to be, as Marxists and those committed to adversarial revolutionary politics do. It's an all's fair in love and wars, values and politics conflict. The hated enemy is liberalism and capitalism. They just fundamentally reject modern world's quest for any sort of voluntary win-wins, capitalist free markets and democratic liberalism. Failing that, we're rejecting fundamentally any sort of tolerance. And that's the contemporary form of various neo-Marxist and Frankfurt School adversarial politicized strategizing. All right, and then the fourth one, the one I called the Mott and Bailey wokists, this is one that has its intellectual roots in Niccolo Machiavelli and Alexis Tocqueville, interestingly. And here the issue is about power. power, not primarily about Marxist politics being reworked or irrational value commitments and the Great Awakening, or this idea that somehow the modern world is a giant mistake and we need to go back to some sort of tribalism. Instead, here the issue is power, but in a very clear-eyed sense. And what you're doing is you are forming power coalitions to advance your goals, and you're going to be forming those power coalitions with those who are sincere, even if you don't sincerely hold with their values as well. But those will be people whom you can use in your power coalition because they are sincere, but they typically have a limited understanding of the ideas that they are committed to. Therefore, those people can serve as useful moral cover for whatever power agenda it is that you have. And so this is a kind of a contemporary form of amoral, Machiavelli-inspired politicking, and it's combined in this case with Alexis de Tocqueville's diagnosis of many early Americans' socially enforced egalitarian impulses. So lots and lots of Americans for whom social egalitarianism, is part of their American identity. There really is a long tradition of that, and they think they are good people. They think they are decent people, and so they're going to be pushing for egalitarianism along multiple social dimensions, but those are the people who are going to be serving as moral cover for the Machiavellian types who have a power struggle and who will form power coalitions with them. Now, these four elements or these four components of the big tent that is wokeism, I'm not saying that this exhausts its membership, but I think they do identify the intellectual history genealogy. The modern woke, depending on if you are an intellectual history and you want to know where these things are coming from philosophically and the big names who are behind it, then you find yourself going back to Rousseau and Heidegger and Kierkegaard and Sartre and Marx and Marcuse and Machiavelli and the others. But if we're going to have then a full history of the evolution of postmodernism to the woke, I think there are other elements and other manifestations that do have to be included. This is not simply a top-down intellectual. Here we have some big picture abstract philosophical themes that have been worked out, and it's a straightforward application. Instead, if we're going to really drill down into the woke, we also would need to cover these developments. And here I've got a list of other podcasts I'm hoping to get to. But how do we go from universal postmodern principles? That already sounds a little bit paradoxical, but the idea of general skepticism about narratives and so forth, how that gets detailed in specific intellectual and cultural fields. So we can take the idea that we should be skeptical about meta-narratives. What does that mean for the law? What does that mean for art, for history, for sex and gender studies, and so on? So we're going from universal postmodernism to all of the area-specific detailings of postmodernism. How do we go from theory to practice? So postmodernism is often highly theoretical, highly abstract set of principles, claims, and arguments, and so forth. But how do we apply that high theory to educational methods? So we want to take theory, say, in the philosophy department, and then transform the next generation of teachers who are then going to go out and teach. But we also need to transform the curriculum. We need to transform the pedagogical methods, how we're training the teachers, what outcomes we are trying to assess, and so forth. So theory of postmodernism has to be applied to specific, in this case, using as an example, educational methods. How do we psychologically, as individuals, how do we take these abstract postmodern philosophies? Suppose we read deeply into all of this stuff and we've got all of these big ideas kicking in our heads, but how do I as an individual operationalize it in my personal psychology? What does it mean for my thinking habits, for my emotional habits, for my habits of action or inaction, how I'm going to react in social settings, and so forth. So abstract principles don't just float around. They don't even just float around in people's heads. People detail them and make them part of the working furniture of working machinery, whatever metaphor works here, of their personal psychology. Also, it's not necessarily the case that we start with postmodern philosophy and then things get applied to politics. In many cases, as you get to know people, the order goes the other way. There are many people who start with a prior commitment to a politics. They have an ideology. They have a value framework that they want the government to put into practice or to impose on all of society. First and foremost, they are political animals or political beings, and then after the fact, postmodernist philosophy comes to be used pragmatically by them for strategic and tactical purposes. And then, of course, there's a significant number of people in the woke movement as well who, for various possible reasons, they're not political beings, they're not intellectual historians, they're not particularly philosophical. Instead, what has happened to them or by them is that they first have developed a personal psychology that's characterized by alienation, rage, and or envy, and then when they encounter postmodern ideas, but later, they find comfort in the postmodern ideas. They find license in those postmodern ideas. But first, they are damaged individuals psychologically, and postmodernism comes to be playing some sort of intellectual / psychological role for them. Now, that one is outside my scope of expertise as a philosopher, so I would turn that one over to professional psychologists to work out. But nonetheless, we run into these people, and then it's clear that that's sadly what the situation is. So, with all of that by means of background, let's take up an untangling of the two puzzles. The first being why the woke seem to reject the most successful anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-privilege movement in history, and how we can get from this apparently skeptical and empty abstract set of ideas we call postmodernism to these universalist, action-oriented, in a particular direction, absolutist wokeists.
You're listening to Open College on the Possibly Correct Network, with renowned philosopher and author, Dr. Stephen Hicks. A podcast to explain the chaos, taking an in-depth look into how postmodernism is affecting the modern world and your lives without you even realizing it. Stay up to date with the latest releases and news from Dr. Hicks by following the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Minds.com, or sign up to our email list at www.opencollegepodcast.com. While you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your chosen media player. Now back to the podcast.
All right, so how do we get from postmodern theory to woke activism? I'm reminded of a joke. This would be for those who've seen the Godfather movies, Marlon Brando in the first generation playing the Godfather, and then after his death, his son Michael Corleone takes over, and this big trilogy of Godfather movies. So that's just to get that in your mind. If you haven't seen them, of course, put them on your next movie binge list. But if you've seen the Godfather films and you've encountered some postmodern writing, here's the joke. What do you get when you cross the Godfather with a postmodernist? And the answer is an offer you can't understand. Haha, okay, I like that joke, but postmodernism, more seriously, does have a deserved reputation for rejecting logic, rejecting objectivity, reason in general, and so to be fuzzy, expressionistic, and often paradoxical in its rhetoric. Yet, there is a logic to the development of the illogic. Negative epistemology, however irrational and illogical it is on its own, it works with human psychology, which is something real, and it works with human valuing along clear developmental steps. So I want to walk through these steps. So suppose we start step one with high theory postmodernism. And so we're going back to the first generation of postmodernists, Lyotard, Derrida, Rorty, Foucault, and the others. All of them are philosophy PhDs. They're all people who got a first-rate education in epistemology. They're all very smart guys. Epistemology in the 1940s and 50s, when they are students, when they are graduate students, when they are graduating with their PhDs, is in a skeptical phase. Logical positivism has collapsed. Existentialism's emotionalism is ascendant. Various analytic schools of philosophy are in disarray. Pragmatism is retreating into more subjectivity and workability from a more classical Peircean than Deweyan or Jamesian kind of pragmatism into the neo-pragmatism that someone like Richard Rorty is going to self-label as. So what we find then is this skepticism of meta-narratives, and that's the phrase from Lyotard, who the skepticism of meta-narratives is defining postmodernism's basic stance. From this perspective, the entire positive apparatus of cognition, perception, conceptualization, grammar, logic, in the pursuit of truth, it's all suspect. And so postmoderns will typically substitute the term narratives for theories. Theories are supposed to be about true accounts of the world. Well, we're backing away from that. We're just talking about narratives now. We're just telling stories. And instead of being logical, you'll find they'll speak of being compelling and advancing attractive rhetoric. Instead of being objective and true, they start putting these kind of cognitive success words in scare quotes. Ironic and true, right? Putting the scare quotes or the finger quotation marks, and that's meant to be indicating that we're using these terms now in a distancing. I'm putting the word out there, but I'm not really meaning it. There's a certain kind of irony built into it. Okay, all of that is background, step one, that's the context. But what follows from skepticism about truth? What should we do? Suppose we reach this very skeptical end of the road. Should we just stop talking about truth altogether? Should we relativize it? Should we stop talking about the truth and speak only about, say, my truth or our truths and pluralize it? There are multiple truths out there. Now, step two then is this embrace of relativism that follows from the skepticism. If the so-called truth is just my or our subjective projection of a possible reality out there, then it seems to follow that no one's so-called truth is better or worse than anyone else's so-called truth. Skepticism leads to a relativism. Step three is then to infer that, well, maybe we should at a minimum be tolerant of all subjectivisms, as no one really is in a position to say that any other's subjectivity is objectively wrong. Each individual or group has their own way of seeing and thinking and feeling and evaluating, so we should all accept the differences and go our separate ways. So we go from skepticism to relativism to tolerance. Step four, though, is a more ambitious and other-embracing relativism. It's the attempt to try to cross the bounds of subjectivity and to become more multicultural oneself. Yes, I was born into a certain cultural group, and it has its own subjective way of looking at things and values, and yes, I have my own individual subjectivities as well, but I become sensitized to the fact that there are lots and lots of relativities out there, lots and lots of value frameworks, and I'm not going to, or trying rather not to stay stuck in my own little little bubble. I'm going to try to embrace other people's context, step inside their shoes, see the world, and be a multicultural person as much as I possibly can. And so here we have the move that says individuals should strive to understand and to incorporate into their own lifestyles the beliefs and the customs of radically other groups. So then we go from a skepticism to a relativism to a tolerance to a kind of multiculturalism. Now, step 5, though, is cold water. It is to learn that it really is difficult to impossible to absorb another culture's alien worldview and to make it feel genuine. It's fine to be a tourist in some other group's way of dressing and eating and living and so forth, but to really become that and to have that a genuine firsthand experience, maybe that's just impossible. And also, further cold water is that other cultures seem frequently uninterested in returning the favor. So what one then does is begins to abandon this multicultural mixing and to start to retreat to self-isolating groups. What's the point of trying to be multicultural if I'm not going to be very good at it, and if the other multicultures are not very interested in trying to do the same with respect to me? I might as well just stick with my own group and embrace that and find some form of genuineness there. Now, step 6 then is something that follows closely, and it stems from feeling that, this watered down mix of other cultural beliefs and practices, it's not only difficult to do, but it's also insipid. It's unsatisfying. And it seems to be that you note that what really gets you going is when you are strongly feeling authenticity, and that seems to come most easily when you commit fully, strongly, wholeheartedly to your own group's ways of doing things and rejecting alien influences, being totally and authentically convinced to your own tribe, and keeping it pure, not allowing mixing from other alien groups that are going to undermine the purity. So we have a robust commitment to a balkanization. Now, full isolation, though, of one's group from all of the other groups is very difficult, and often it is impossible. And some of those groups, many of those groups, actually historically, they have a legacy of seeing themselves as superior to the other groups. And so it's not only that they want to commit to their own groups and every group go their own way, they think that their group's way is superior and they want to impose their superiority. And those other groups, especially those that have been on the receiving end of past impositions, they want revenge on the groups that have asserted their superiority in the past. So then what we have then is, once we have all of these groups committing authentically to their own group's values and wanting to find a full sense of meaning there, some of those group packages have to say, well, what we need to do to be authentic to our group is to continue our tradition of imposing on other groups. And of course, there's lots of other groups that have been on the receiving end, and they're largely animated by resentment and a desire to revenge. And that's where their commitment to their own group's values and ways of looking feels most authentic. On top of that, I've just got all of the traditional prejudices, the ethnocentrisms, the racisms, and sexisms that have been handed down from generation to generation. Those generate new conflicts in this generation. They also are an obstacle both to multicultural mixing and just let's all go our own way isolation. And then, of course, we have an ideological labor. Such conflicts between various kinds of groups, they can be upgraded to philosophical level by people who are committed to Marxist or Frankfurt School theories, or, of course, other theories that take exploitation as a fundamental metaphysical or social psychological reality. So what we've got at the end of step 6 here is a bunch of isolated groups in conflict with each other, and we've rejected the object of knowledge and so forth. Now the step 7, this is the 7th step, I think is then what's typically called balkanization, using the Balkan part of the world and its often violent history. The balkanization then of social groups into these mutually hostile camps. And the hostilities seem unsolvable from this perspective because we're skeptics. We think values are subjective, and we think subjectively formed values are fundamentally in conflict with each other. The skeptical relativism tells us that the groups, they don't have any rational or objective recourse to settling their differences. And from this perspective, then, liberalism, its commitments to civility, to mutual understanding, to compromise, negotiation, and tolerance, well, those are silly, and we should just abandon them. And when this stage is reached, this is a seventh step, each group's most activist members will decide that committing to achieving dominance for its own group, that's the realistic option. Finally, step 8 is just the open embrace of power, force, and violence as the only methods, the only realistic methods of settling differences. And that's my 8-step reconstruction, how we get from postmodernism's initially empty skepticism, but how it transforms itself step by step into woke power play absolutism.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claim that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks's concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy to understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself. Now back to the podcast.
Now, what makes all of this postmodern is not only that kind of this anything goes is a consequence of skepticism, but there's a conscious adoption of anything goes as strategy. If truth and justice are abandoned philosophically on principle as guiding standards, then only power matters, and the successful use of power sanctions any tactic. For example, if one needs to undercut a powerful opposing view with lots of logical argumentation, arguing that no one knows the truth, it's useful. If one needs to make room for a position that hasn't much factual support, arguing that all viewpoints are equally valid is useful. If one wants to make a feeling-based commitment to an ideology, arguing that objectivity is merely a different feeling-based commitment is useful. If one wants to advance one's own group's interests, then arguing that other groups have objectively harmed one's group's interests is useful. Now, that's just 4. All 4 of those are logically inconsistent with each other, but that doesn't matter. What matters is, do they work? Use those claims, use those kinds of rhetorical strategies as strategic principles, rather, as tactics whenever they use. The inconsistency doesn't matter. And here I would just have a quotation from Michel Foucault, who said explicitly that in the pursuit of power, logical inconsistency does not matter, does not matter. Here's a quotation from History of Sexuality. which is a much less sexy book than you might think from the title, but here's the quotation. Quote, "Discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in the field of force relations." All right, now I'm just going to pause there in this quotation. Notice the very military war type of language here. Discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in the field of force relations. Picking up the quotation again, there can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. So the issue is not whether you are logically true, valid, sound, right? Contradiction is fine if it works for your strategy. Recall also that Richard Rorty said pragmatic workability as his standard means that appealing rhetoric and not argued truth is the issue. A quotation from Rorty, quote, "Conforming to my own precepts, I am not going to offer arguments against the vocabulary I want to replace. Instead, I'm going to try to make the vocabulary I favor look attractive." So we've got some words, some language, some rhetoric that I favor, a kind of subjective, right? I'm not saying that this is objectively true and factual, right, and so forth. And I'm not going to say that it is logical, it is objective, it is true. It just looks attractive, and my goal is to make it look attractive. So we're talking about attractiveness and using words in a social way to achieve whatever you want without making any claims about argumentation. Now, also with this diversity of conflicting strategies, there comes a diversity of conflicting labels and all sorts of linguistic maneuvers. From the postmodern perspective, actually from everybody's perspective, words are a form of social power, but it's just that in strong forms of postmodernism, words are really the only form of power. Everything from their perspective is linguistically, socially constructed. And recall that Jacques Derrida said that nothing exists outside of language. It's all really just words. And here's a quotation from Derrida, quote, "The fact of language is probably the only fact ultimately to resist all parenthization." And parenthization is the idea that you can put something in brackets or put something in parenthesis and step outside of it to a more real perspective. You can't get outside of language. We're inside the parentheses always, so to speak. So consequently, from the postmodern perspective, and this is what the woke are doing, the effective use of words as a weapon in the social conflict, that becomes a strategic necessity. So while we're talking about words, I want to talk about the power of labels and what this concept of woke means. I gave a generalized description at the beginning, said it was a big tent, and gave 4 woke variations. But let's say a little more about this particular term. Who gets to use the word woke? Now, we have to argue about labels. It's necessary. It can be frustrating. And as part of the frustration is that some people are using words in trying to communicate clearly, while lots of other people, they use words lazily, or they intentionally obscure them for rhetorical purposes. Sometimes it's a matter of academic style. There's this revelatory anecdote from the philosopher John Searle from one of his conversations with Foucault. And Foucault, as Searle reports, said to him, quote, "In France, you've got to have 10% incomprehensible. Otherwise, people won't think it's deep. They won't think you're a profound thinker." So the use of obscurity extends to others' words, as you can attempt to subvert them, other people's words, their language, and transform them into something less powerful. So the idea here is that language is a tool that we are using in battle, and sometimes, of course, it is the battleground itself. Now, on this word woke, though, the modern liberals do have the first claim historically to be woke. They were born of the Enlightenment, enlighten Enlightenment, which was positioning itself against the dark ages of humankind's previous eras. Finally, they argued, we were lifting ourselves out of ignorance, out of superstition and oppression. We are removing the self-imposed veils and the other imposed shackles, and we are awakening to a sunlit future. So there's the woke language. Philosopher Immanuel Kant, representative in some ways of the Enlightenment, but particularly when he uses woke language in noting that he was, quote, awakened from his dogmatic slumber by a sharp critique of philosophy's assumptions up to his generation. So you do find this language in the Enlightenment and among some Enlightenment liberals. The various great awakenings in a religious context from the 1700s on into the mid-1800s, they're also another early candidate for woke, the label. As recurring sharp increases, this religious enthusiasm, they made their mark on culture. And often the great awakenings, religious ones, were in reactions against the more naturalistic Enlightenment, the rational and secular tendencies of the modern Enlightenment. Now, the awakenings were not only a personal realization of one's sinfulness, a stripping away of overlying self-deceits to reveal underlying depravity, but they also were a commitment to social and political activism to remake society morally along Great Awakening religious grounds. As we get into the 1900s, woke language continued to be used in American black churches, often to highlight kind of being alertly vigilant to racism. In more secular movements, the idea of false consciousness came to the fore. In psychology, there are schools such as Freudianism. They come to speak of the illusions that we accept for ourselves in order to repress or otherwise deny unseemly underlying psychic realities. So we will go into hypnosis, we will go into dreams, and that will be revelatory, and then ultimately we will wake up to a fuller understanding of what's going on in our psychology. In sociology, there are schools such as the Frankfurt School. They come to speak of culturally imposed illusions that are generated by the powers that be to mask the reality of social oppression. So Paulo Freire, for example, stated, here's a quotation from Freire, quote, "The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines." In racial versions, Frantz Fanon has this metaphor of wearing a white mask over black skin, and that's representative here. So the idea here is in these more sociological versions, some sort of consciousness raising or awakening or stripping off the veil or removing the mask, either by a critically trained analyst or a social theorist, was necessary to once you've wakened the victim up to the dark reality that surrounds him or her. So this language of woke is in various schools also in the 1900s. The cognitive thread of development was also parallel to a political activist thread of development. And this is dominated by, there's a lot of different neo-Marxism in the 1900s. And I want to focus here on the woke and its connection to political correctness. Political correctness came to prominence in early neo-Marxism. Now, the phrase was used originally in Soviet Russian and Communist Chinese institutional policy. After Marxist revolutions were successful in Russia and in China, political correctness became a label for approved policy enacted in all areas of life. Any decision, whether it's a scientific decision, artistic, economic, or familial, had to pass the test of being politically correct, according to Leninist, Stalinist, or Maoist Marxism. We see this coming across the oceans to North America. There's the New Left shift in the 1960s. Various neo-Marxisms, other forms of leftism come to have strong influence in American culture. And then politically correct in the American context came to mean not an official government policy, but just a more authoritarian imposition of ideology by anyone who was in a position to do so because of their social power. So what we have then is a history of the word woke, a mini history of political correctness. This also has to be integrated with the language of social justice, which has also evolved over the 1900s from, I think its roots on my reading are in Catholic social theory and Catholic social activism in the 1800s to its adoption by more secular movements in the 1900s who agreed with Catholicism's social activist aims, but they don't necessarily buy into the underlying religious philosophy. Now, by the time we get to the late 1900s, though, terminology is going to change because of political events. Marxism has collapsed in its Soviet Russian form. Communist China in the 1990s was thought to be remaking itself after its disastrous experiments with Maoist Marxism. So politically correct also had come to be kind of a difficult claim for friendly to Marxist fellow travelers to make. And so the politically correct label was abandoned by the left in the 1990s. It had a bad association for them. They realized they had to move on. But the opponents of leftism had come to recognize the actual success of the New Left's long march through the institutions, at the same time rejoicing over its overt political failures in Russia and China, but the long march through the institutions in North America and other parts of Western Europe and the international English-speaking countries, especially in higher education, opponents of leftism came to recognize how serious that threat was to now what seemed to be traditional liberal values in education. So in reaction, it's in the 1990s and beyond that it's the opponents of that kind of leftism. They start to use politically correct, but they are using it as a pejorative. So notice what we've got here is just this whole network of labels: awakened, false consciousness, social justice, politically correct. They were in play, and they have been in play for a long time, and each one is evolving, but now the stage is set for the rhetorical battle over labels of the early 2000s on into our generation. So I want to say as a sideline that the political right also has its woke variant labels. If you think of the red pill from the 1999 movie The Matrix, this is a very clear example. In the movie, the protagonist's psyche is kind of unknowingly trapped in a virtual reality. His physical body is in some sort of liquid pod, and it's being used as an energy source by some shadowy oppressive forces for their own benefit. And the protagonist is offered a red pill, which once he takes it, enables him to awaken from his induced coma-like state and to become aware of the dark reality of oppression and devastation that he actually lives in. So that is the same kind of metaphorical language in this case from a popular culture movie, but it's performing the same function. Now, woke in our generation is thus the newest in the evolution of labels. But this portion of the ideological territory, it's a big tent. Various members of the big tent emphasize different aspects of it. For some, the key feature of woke is just cognitive consciousness raising, overcoming false consciousness. For some, woke means a strong commitment to social justice aims. For some, woke means using more forceful methods of activism. And for some, woke means the whole package: a cognitive state, a set of goals, and a method to achieve them. That is, to be fully woke embodies critical rejection of liberalism as an illusion, a total commitment to social justice goals, and a willingness to use physically forceful and even brutal activism. The same meanings are ascribed by those who use woke as a pejorative. Now, I want to end somewhat inconclusively. We're in the middle of a culture war over knowledge and skepticism, individualism, collectivism, universal rights, relativized tribalism, civilized procedures, and fighting in the streets. So, the puzzles of postmodernism and the woke, I think they are resolved by realizing that philosophical battles are complex. They involve a number of sub-controversies, and each of those sub-controversies has a history, and that each of them continues to evolve. The contribution of postmodernism is its hollowing out of the modern Enlightenment's philosophy, and it leaves nothing but relativistic subjectivities in contestation. That hollowing out, though, means that the new generation does not learn of the great successes of modernity. It doesn't learn about the Enlightenment. It doesn't learn about liberalism. History, education, and so forth is said. Or it is taught that those things are failures and frauds, that modernity is a failure, the Enlightenment was just false, liberalism is a fraud. And so the most successful anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-privilege movement in history is abandoned to a significant extent by a new generation. And intellectual negativism does not by itself stop all action. Postmodernism is a hollowing out of reason. It's a hollowing out and an emptying of realism and individualism and civility. But human beings still are, in fact, value-seeking beings. If they're just taught that all is subjectivist, relativist, adversarial, or if they're just plunged into a social terrain that's dominated by such ideas, conflict and nastiness, they will respond in a way that seems best to them to preserve or achieve whatever values they happen to have. So necessarily then, postmodern ideology generates a brutal social battlefield. Now, I'm going to end here inconclusively because the battle is now joined. We know what the stakes are, but the outcome is not known. At the turn of the 2000s, that the Enlightenment had a battle on its hands, that perhaps was not clear. But by now, the culture wars are apparent to everyone, and that at least is an important step forward.